AT&T was once America's biggest private company. In 1980, they had 1,040,000 employees, including 7,400 Smiths, 5,880 Johnsons, 3,934 Williamses. Over 70% of American households had a telephone. 80% of those telephones came from the Bell system. 90% of the local calls made on those telephones were facilitated by an AT&T affiliated company. And almost 100% of the long-distance calls were handled by AT&T itself using its majestic nationwide network. How does such a company end? In today's video, we take the mightiest corporation the modern world has ever seen. I don't want to hear any meme comments about the East India Company, and break it up. By the 1930s, it was clear that AT&T had no credible competition. After the fundamental Alexander Graham Bell patents expired in the early 1890s, dozens of non-Bell affiliated or independent telephone companies popped up to wire up their local areas. By 1902, there were 4,000 such companies. At first, people welcomed the competition. They did not like AT&T's imperial attitude and seemingly high prices, and the government saw a monopoly as socially inefficient. However, the chaos of competition soured people, and where did that bring them? Right back to AT&T. Over the 1910s and 1920s, AT&T was allowed to acquire or interconnect those independents, who were often glad to sell out. A new market structure emerged where smaller telephone companies, the Bell operating companies, part owned by AT&T, handle local telephone monopoly networks. Meanwhile, AT&T itself runs the single long-distance network connecting them all. Together, the local and long-distance networks are the Bell system. By 1934, the independents had 21% of the market, mostly just rural areas. The U.S. allowed this. In return, AT&T agreed to submit itself to government oversight, the beginning of a long and unhappy relationship. Over time, a regulation regime evolved. In 1934, the U.S. government set up the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, which took over for the relatively impotent ICC. The FCC held jurisdiction over the interstate networks. State and local public utility commissions regulated their own local telephone networks, setting rates to guarantee a reasonable rate of return while providing good, universal service. And to be honest, for a long time, the telephone service itself worked fine. For decades, people generally acknowledged that the rates and profits were acceptable, albeit premium, and the service was good, especially compared to the world's other networks. It was all the other stuff that AT&T did or tried to do that bothered people. America and Americans were and never will be comfortable with a monopoly, especially one of this size metastasizing within their borders. One thing that the American government never liked about AT&T was its vertical integration. Unlike other telephone companies like those abroad in Europe, AT&T owned its own telephone and telecommunications equipment supplier, Western Electric. AT&T also owned the country's largest private research laboratory, Bell Labs. Back in its heyday, Western Electric was a consumer electronics giant in its own right, kind of like a General Electric, making typewriters, vacuum cleaners, radios, and more. But after the acquisition, they would only serve AT&T and the U.S. military. In 1967, Western Electric made $3.5 billion in revenue, which equates to about $33 billion today. Of that, $3 billion came from AT&T and the military for the rest. By 1979, Western Electric made $11 billion, or $47 billion today, and they employed a staggering 150,000 people, which was a seventh of AT&T's total workforce. When AT&T's corporate predecessor, American Bell, acquired Western Electric during the days of its patent monopoly, they were not really thinking about the vertical integration advantages of having their own equipment manufacturer. But Western Electric proved to be a formidable asset, the engineering glue and manufacturing muscle of the overall Bell system. Western Electric, Bell Labs, and AT&T, with the Bell operating companies, were all intimately linked together. AT&T funded and drove the product R&D development agendas at Western Electric and Bell Labs. Western Electric systems engineers bridged teams to integrate Bell Labs' inventions into products. And Bell Labs, in turn, set up R&D labs right inside Western Electric factories. The best example of the power of this integration occurred after Bell Labs invented the first transistor in 1947. The device was first mass-produced in a Western Electric factory in Allentown. There, the quality control guru Bonnie Small led the movement to apply statistical techniques to improve product quality. Under her tenure, over 5,000 quote-unquote control charts were produced to monitor process data for deviations during manufacturing. Members of the U.S. government have long been suspicious of Western Electric's close relationships with AT&T, and competing telecommunications equipment makers grumbled about being shut out of a massive market despite having what they feel is better and cheaper stuff. AT&T and Western Electric disagreed with that, of course, arguing that their equipment was well priced and quite good. And I think most people concur that Western Electric made very high quality product, meant to last for decades. During the 1930s, Holmes Baldrige served as an investigator for the FCC investigating AT&T, but he then moved to the Justice Department, and there he convinced Attorney General Tom Clark to launch a 1949 lawsuit against AT&T. The lawsuit accused the company of using its captive telephone monopoly to also monopolize the telephone equipment market for unfair profit. The lawsuit sought to break off Western Electric from AT&T and split it into 3 companies. This is where the politics get involved. As I mentioned, Western Electric was a major defense contractor, operating nationally important facilities like Sandia Laboratories. Shortly after the Korean War broke out in 1950, the Defense Department intervened, asking the Justice Department to freeze the lawsuit for the sake of the war effort. And of course, the Justice Department complied. Then after that, in 1953, AT&T lobbied the incoming Dwight Eisenhower administration, telling them that breaking up Western Electric would disrupt its deep involvement in national defense projects during the Cold War, like the distant early warning line of radar systems in the Arctic. The Eisenhower administration agreed with AT&T and asked them to submit their own concessions. In June 1954, they did, and thus we have the 1956 consent decree that let AT&T keep Western Electric and Bell Labs at the cost of being unable to compete in any industry other than telecommunications. The company also had to sell their interest in Canada's Northern Electric, which later became Nortel. Hope those guys are doing good now. Famously, the consent decree required that AT&T license out its patented technology innovations at a reasonable rate to third parties, even competitors. Considering how much Bell first relied on its exclusive control of the telephone patents, this is an artful move. Even more so considering that the idea came from AT&T itself. Knowing that this was pretty much a win for AT&T and Western Electric, the Justice Department spun the consent decree as a win for electronics competition. The funny thing is that they were correct. Entire new industries were spawned thanks to the diffusion of revolutionary Bell Labs inventions like the transistor, the Unix OS, the C computer language, the laser, and more. Seeing others profit from their work must have really ground their gears. AT&T had always zealously protected its voice telephone monopoly, banning quote-unquote foreign attachments to its equipment. The tariff provision, as it was called, had language like this: no equipment, apparatus, circuit, or device not furnished by the telephone company shall be attached or connected with the facilities furnished by the telephone company, whether physically, by induction, or otherwise. The way AT&T saw it, they had no choice. There were so many unsavory companies advertising ways for customers to either cut their telephone bills or protect their health with this or that unauthorized attachment item. AT&T's duty was to maintain the integrity of its system, and, in their opinion, that duty cannot be done if non-Bell devices were attached to the system. The company was so strict with this ban that they even forbade people from putting plastic covers on its phone books. By the way, for the late millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha kids, phone books were big printed books with everyone's phone numbers and addresses printed in them, kind of like a big offline Google Contacts app, but in paper. If you wanted to call a business for an appointment or someone to go hang out at the roller skate rink and did not know the number, you had to look them up on the phone book. Anyway, where was I? Anyway, yeah, the hushaphone was a metal and plastic cup that you put on the phone to avoid background noise. The company making it had been around since 1921. A very small company. Their total sales in 20 plus years from 1921 to 1949 was just 125,000, of which just 40,000 were still in use as of 1950. Considering that AT&T had 35 million telephones up at that time, that was just 0.117% of the total phone base. But, as I mentioned before, AT&T did not allow any attachments at all, no matter how small. So they threatened to discontinue telephone service to hushaphone users, which hurt hushaphone company sales to the point that they filed a complaint with the FCC. In 1951, the FCC upheld the ban, but then hushaphone appealed to the D.C. federal court, and in 1956, a panel of 3 judges ruled that the attachment was privately beneficial without being publicly detrimental, so they allowed for it. The D.C. court decision essentially overruled the FCC. The Bell system had no choice but to revise their rules to allow mechanical attachments, but kept their prohibition on electrically attached items. World War II had spurred the growth of advanced, high-capacity radio microwave communication systems. In peacetime, companies sought to use this new technology, and the resulting race for spectrum caused problems. But one thing all those guys wanted was to avoid handing the sector to AT&T. As early as 1956, AT&T wanted the FCC to grant it spectrum, basically all of it, so that they can provide new value-added services to customers, including one day connecting computers in different cities. But America's companies saw no reason why the copper wire monopoly needed to get involved in this wireless technology. In November 1956, the TV industry, backed by Motorola, asked the FCC for permission to make quote-unquote private lines so they can beam TV programs directly to their local affiliates. Other industries like the retailers, automobile makers, and big oil companies quickly joined in on this request. And Motorola too. They were then the biggest non-Bell telecommunications player selling microwave radio hardware. The 1956 consent decree essentially booted them out of the Bell system. This appeal to the FCC was their play to expand their own markets. AT&T naturally argued against the private lines. A customer paid the same long-distance rate no matter where they called, meaning some rates subsidized others. They argued microwave providers would only serve the most profitable routes, leaving AT&T with just the non-profitable ones, a form that they called skimming the cream. Throughout the summer of 1957, the FCC heard arguments from both sides for the above 890 megacycles issue. It was widely followed. There had never been before so much interest in such a hearing. Over 160 people gave testimony, 200 more added comments, and over 5,000 pages were filed. Back in the 1900s, the deal made between AT&T and the government was this. AT&T can have their monopoly, but only so long as they provided universal service, a common carrier, without taking excess profits as defined by AT&T's rate of return on its invested capital. To enforce this, regulators saw and approved phone rates based on a variety of factors, including AT&T's invested capital, historical precedent, distance, and quote-unquote fairness. Rates were not based on market forces or the cost of actually providing the service. But by the 1950s, the United States made immense technological progress with things like the computer or microwave communications. Many of these inventions had been created by AT&T's own Bell Labs. Yet AT&T still only had its sturdy but aging network of copper wires. Their microwave service was competent but not great. Several representatives complained about the poor quality of Southern Bell's microwave service. Moreover, members of Congress and the Justice Department criticized the FCC for what was seen as an overly cozy relationship with AT&T. For decades, telecommunications policy was crafted through informal discussions between FCC people and AT&T people. Such things had led to the 1956 consent decree, which FCC and everyone else took significant public heat for. The above 890 hearings were different. For the first time, you not only had a credible industry player, Motorola, involved, but also all the country's major industry groups. The powerful oil industry in particular was very loud about their desire for private lines. They talked in detail about how microwave communications were used to remotely control pumps or connect to offshore oil rigs. Sinclair Refining claimed that 5% of all their expenses were spent on telecommunications alone. In other words, it was all of America's big businesses allied against America's biggest business. Not sure who to root for, eh? The criticism and public attention meant that the FCC can no longer craft policy in the shadows. In 1959, the FCC decided to allow those big businesses to build their own microwave-connected private lines using wavelengths above 890 megahertz. AT&T's reaction to this decision did it no favors. In need of a microwave-based private line offering of their own, they introduced Telpac. The issue was Telpac's prices were shockingly low, just 7/8 of historical precedent. So low that the FCC and the Justice Department, not to mention Motorola, immediately took notice. Either AT&T's new pricing was predatory, set so low to bleach the market of any competition, or its old pricing had been roadside robbery. Neither prospect looked good. AT&T explained that the older prices had been based on historical precedent and costs averaged across the whole nation. These private lines, unconnected to the main network and thus unburdened by history, were thusly based on pure marginal costs. But the FCC found this argument hard to swallow and commissioned studies to find the service's quote-unquote real costs. When AT&T showed some data, the FCC didn't believe it. This went on for years, straining relations between the two. Despite all of these challenges, AT&T, by some metrics, had never been so powerful. From 1963 to 1967, AT&T grew the number of telephones from 84.5 million to 109.2 million. But the tensions that first emerged during the above 890 hearings were intensifying. America, particularly its big businesses, was demanding more from their telecommunications. A prime example was cited in a 1965 story in Business Week where a chemical company wanted to connect their computer system to the telephone network but failed. If AT&T cannot provide services like these, then someone else should have the chance to. Tom Carter was a Texan who in 1946 launched a business selling equipment to oil companies. As I mentioned before, oil industry workers were often based in remote areas, so they were pioneers in using microwave spectrum to communicate. Sniffing an opportunity, Carter made the Carter phone, which let someone with a two-way radio interface with a telephone via an electrically connected base station. This way, a driver can just call a phone via his radio instead of stopping at a phone booth. So unlike the Hushaphone, this went beyond a simple mechanical integration, but that did not make the Carter phone particularly special. Amateur and ham radio operators had something similar. The military used phone patches for servicemen to call home. Many such devices were advertised in the papers. And Carter phone again didn't even sell that many, about 3,000 to 5,000 max. But when AT&T operators started discontinuing service to those they discovered using Carter phones, Carter launched an antitrust lawsuit. The FCC held hearings in October 1966. Nearly 2 years later, in June 1968, the FCC, perhaps mindful of the D.C. Court of Appeals potentially stepping in like it did before with Hushaphone, ruled that AT&T's ban of foreign attachments that do not adversely affect the phone system was illegal. By then, the Carter phone product was long obsolete, but Tom Carter's success enabled an ecosystem of new attachments like recorders, chimes, headsets, answering machines, and perhaps most importantly down the line, the modem. For all of its significance, for a few years after the above 890 megacycles decision, nobody tried to take advantage of it. Then in 1963, a former Armyman named Jack Gokin founded a company called Microwave Communications Corporation, or MCI. A year earlier, Gokin, a former General Electric salesman, had founded a small GE radio distributor. It grew well at first, selling two-way radios to buyers in central Illinois. But after a competing distributor in that area complained, GE cut that down. Fear not, Gokin had another idea. He remembered telling his partners, let's put a microwave system from Chicago and St. Louis. Truckers going down Route 66 between Chicago and St. Louis cannot communicate with radios because their ranges were too short. So Gokin founded MCI and applied for FCC permission for a microwave private line between those two cities, as well as to be able to resell capacity to many business customers. A big difference because prior private lines were only for one user. MCI struggled to stay afloat while its FCC application slowly moved through the bureaucracy. MCI management worked hard to prove to the FCC that they had the financial stability to actually build out said network. Challenges popped up left and right. Gokin's partners and investors either cut their exposure or left. And then GE canceled an agreement to design and supply radio systems for the microwave line, supposedly due to AT&T's pressure. And then the FCC found itself missing a business certificate from Illinois. Then, when the state lagged in issuing that certificate, the FCC initially dismissed MCI's application. But Gokin pushed through with an iron will. He convinced the FCC to look at the application again without needing the Illinois certificate, and he found new investors, particularly those with no love for AT&T, to buy into his vision. Gokin told people the MCI wanted to help small businesses compete by giving them cheaper ways to communicate. In 1966, he told the EDP Weekly magazine that while AT&T and Western Union charged $1.10 per mile within 250 miles, his network would only charge less than 7 cents for the same. Everyone loves an underdog, and MCI played the part perfectly. A fine storyteller, Gokin told people that MCI was like a simple airline, hauling things from one point to another. When FCC hearings finally began in 1966, he and his chairman, William McGowan, argued the point perfectly. AT&T went with their usual cream-skimming argument, but in a case of really bad timing, the company began suffering a surge in major service outages sometime in mid-1967 and continuing throughout 1970. The outages had real reasons: too much demand and insufficient infrastructure to handle it all, but it made it hard to believe that AT&T was doing a good job of being the country's telephone monopoly. In a very close 4-3 vote, the FCC in 1969 allowed for MCI's network. In the year after the MCI decision, 31 companies submitted 1,713 applications to the FCC for over 40,000 miles of lines. MCI and another company called Daytran led the charge. The latter was just as aggressive, wanting to build a network covering 35 cities. Since the FCC prioritized the first to file on a route, wildcat companies rushed to secure their slot. Some just photocopied the original MCI application, changed the bare minimum, and faxed that in. This land rush wreaked havoc on the FCC, and to clean things up in 1971, they introduced a new administrative classification for companies like MCI, the Specialized Common Carrier. This classification essentially created a new form of low-cost competition with AT&T, and critically, AT&T didn't price match the insurgents, not only because of the ongoing Telpac tensions, but also because doing so would have forced AT&T to cut prices for all their other users. Classic business disruption. When the FCC created this classification, they did so knowing that those networks would inevitably want to also connect to AT&T's network, but figured that since the whole private line space contributed just 3% of AT&T's overall revenues, it would be fine. But that's exactly what happened. Later in 1975, an aggressive MCI launched ExecuNet, a microwave service connecting 24 cities in the U.S. with way cheaper rates, albeit with the much greater hassle of dialing up to 20 numbers. MCI wanted to connect to AT&T's network. MCI chairman McGowan told AT&T chairman John DeButz that they were willing to pay a fee for it, but DeButz declined. McGowan got heated and said, "I have plenty of money. I can spend it on litigation, or I can spend it on construction. I would prefer to spend it on construction." DeButz, unfazed, said, "I've heard threats like that before. I won't be coerced." AT&T complained to the FCC, which at first barred the ExecuNet service, but then MCI went over the FCC's head again to the U.S. Court of Appeals. In 1978, the judge, in a rather activist move, stepped in and ruled that FCC cannot bar competition from the market, and let Execunet go forth. In November 1974, the Justice Department launched its third antitrust lawsuit against AT&T. The lawsuit charged that AT&T was using its dominant position to suppress competition and enhance its monopoly. They sought to break up the company, including the divestment of its Bell operating companies, Bell Labs and Western Electric. Why now? There was intense pressure on the Justice Department to do something. AT&T was facing 40 private antitrust lawsuits from companies big and small, many having also complained to Congress. Much of the early evidence for this case came from MCI, which first started passing stuff to the Justice Department as early as 1973. With the FCC seemingly unable to resolve these issues, the Justice Department moved forward with its own action, particularly after new President Gerald Ford gave his tacit approval. This lawsuit came a few years after a similar antitrust lawsuit against IBM. That particular IBM lawsuit quickly turned into a legal quagmire that went on for over a decade. Suing yet another massive American giant threatened a second such morass for the antitrust division. At first, AT&T's management said that they would fight the suit, pointing out how they provided reliable nationwide service while keeping prices low. But in 1979, as the case slowly made its way towards a trial, their chairman, John DeButz, retired, and a new chairman, Charlie L. Brown, took office. Charlie Brown was the consummate AT&T insider. His father and mother both worked at the company as a traffic manager and operator. Soft-spoken, he brought a fresh new view on the old AT&T structure. In June 1980, AT&T lost a private antitrust jury trial to MCI. The jury lacked any sympathy for Ma Bell and awarded the tiny MCI $600 million, which antitrust laws then automatically tripled for a staggering $1.8 billion. And, as mentioned earlier, the same evidence that MCI used for that trial was also provided to the Justice Department for its own AT&T case. So, this did not look good. In the wake of this loss, Brown's general counsel, Howard Trenans of the law firm Sibley Austin, asked why AT&T was fighting so hard to keep its local affiliates, when two other law firm clients he served were trying equally hard to spin theirs off. Intrigued, Charlie Brown called the board and reviewed the options and situation in front of them. The industry had changed, and AT&T was finding it harder to compete with the insurgents when it had one arm tied behind its back thanks to the 1956 consent decree. In the late 1970s, the company also found itself investing an increasing amount of money into its Western local networks, which took up some 90% of its total construction budget. That money can be better invested in other things, but that would draw the attention of the local regulators. So, spinning off the Bell operating companies might free them from having to fund these investments. Congress was also coming. Several bills had been introduced with their own take on separation, whether it be separating the Bell operating companies or Western Electric. None had yet to pass, but it only added to the feeling of an impending threat. So in the end, Brown made the wrenchingly difficult call to do it to themselves before it can be done to them. And the way they chose was to divest the baby bells rather than Western Electric. This way, the remaining AT&T company can still provide long-distance service, a service they assume would remain profitable in the long run. And keeping Bell Labs and Western Electric would give them the vertically integrated technology and engineering excellence to compete with IBM and other tech giants. In December 1980, the two sides started negotiating and hammered out the general principles. Those principles remained in the final settlement even after the Reagan administration took over and the case entered trial in 1981. The settlement was announced in January 1982 and carried out after the Supreme Court upheld the settlement in 1983. And that was that. The end of an empire started off slowly at first, bits and pieces, and then suddenly, all at once. So what broke up AT&T? First, the rise of new technologies with high potential for connection, the connected computer most of all, caused customer dissatisfaction with AT&T's plodding progress. Second, and similarly, the emergence of microwave wireless communications technologies allowed for a new class of business insurgents that the government encouraged and protected. When AT&T challenged these companies, it found itself skewered as a monopolist. The conflict advanced to where The company had few friends anywhere in the industry or within politics. And third, the government could not separate AT&T and Western Electric, but it could, through a series of legal cases, pry open the closed equipment ecosystem, encouraging more competition in what before had been only an AT&T world. And finally, AT&T thought it saw a brighter future ahead in the, quote, enhanced telecommunications and information services fields. It was the reason why they kept Western Electric and Bell Labs. But it all went wrong very quickly. A year after divestment, Brown said it was a mistake to break up something that didn't need breaking. The years after the breakup suffered consumer confusion, higher phone rates, and a decline in quality. And many years later, in the late 1990s, a massive bubble. But that is a story for another time. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the Patreon, and I'll see you guys next time.